Hey everybody, welcome back to the Spin Rack. This is Mars here. I'm here with my boys, Petey and Cal. Say what's up, gents.
Hey, what's going on?
Yeah, ready to rock.
Hey, today we got sad news. Jim Shooter passed away. He was a legend in the comic book industry, a legend in Marvel, and a legend in DC. As usual, we're going to have our resident experts go delve a little bit more into the impact that Shooter had in the comic book industry. Give us a little background of where he started from, and why he was such a divisive figure um, in some artists and creators' views. I'll pass this on to Petey. Petey, can you give a little background about Shooter?
Um, yes, Jim Shooter, first and foremost, was a writer. That's what he started out when he was 13, needing to help out his family in Pittsburgh, and he decided that he was. I think he was sick, and he was reading comic books, and he distilled that the Marvel comic books of the '60s were better than what was coming out in from DC. So he said, "What if I figured this out, and I took it over to DC?" So he would once he figured he had a good handle on what Stan Lee was doing, he sent some scripts with actual drawings of the whole comic book, and he sent them over to the editor of Superman, Mort Wessinger, and he liked them. So he bought them, and he asked them to send some more, and then they got on the phone, and he was like, "I'm going to buy those other two, but I need a couple more plots, and we're meeting at such and such, so we need you to come out." And he was like, he stopped talking, and then they were like, "What's going on?" I said, "Well, I had to ask my mother." And he's like, "How old are you?" And he said 13. And then so let me talk to your mother. And then he became, after he was a writer, a freelance writer, but then professional, working directly with Mort Wessinger and dealing with one of the toughest editors in comic books. So he went to write Superman, creating the Parasite, did a lot of work on the Legion of Superheroes, and then for a while he stepped away from comic books, was the editor for Marvel for a little while, went back to DC doing the Legion, and then he went back to Marvel as an assistant editor of I think who was it? I think he was Archie Goodwin's assistant at one point. He might have been Jerry Conway's also. No, it was Marv Wolfman's assistant, and then Archie Goodwin. And then when Archie Goodwin, who was the longest, no, after Roy Thomas, Archie Goodwin was the longest post Roy Thomas, because Roy Thomas had it for about 5 years. But then there's a stretch where it was just the editor wasn't an actual editor in chief. It was just a top editor title. And then when Roy Thomas, who had just done Star Wars for Marvel and it was successful, once they couldn't come to an agreement of an editor rate and a writer rate, then the editor in chief went to Jim Shooter, and Jim Shooter went to work at Marvel. He already was adding in wanting more editing in the titles. Marvel had kind of moved away from heavy editing since they had writer editors. Everyone wanted to be like Stan, and he was bringing back editing the book. So at that time, he could see, and he would, help a lot of young talent get better. Some of the young talent at the time were John Byrne, Frank Miller. Those are the ones I know particularly that he went to help. He would work with writers who would not change stories, but at times I think one of the better stories, Doug Mensch came to him and said, "I don't have a story for who's it yeah, what's it Master of Kung Fu. I don't have a story for it." And he was like, "Well, what do you got?" I said, "Well, I got this story. He just does XYZ, but there's no action in it. You can't do a Marvel story without action." And then Jim Shooter said, "This is Marvel. You can do whatever you want. So just tell me the story you got." So he told him the story, and he's like, "Yeah, let's do that." So he did a Master and Kung Fu story without action, and he was, at that point he was very instrumental in getting Marvel not only editing but also getting them back on time, hiring a lot of editors. A lot of those editors became writers at the same time too. And Marvel had a lot of talent that were coming in at the same time, really hitting their mark and taking a chance on, I think, Frank Miller as an artist, taking a chance on Byrne, as even though he knew Byrne was writing stories from time to time, right, as a writer on the Fantastic Four. And then Marvel, like, kind of eclipsed, doing, even way better than DC. But DC also had strides because they brought in, what's that thing? Royalties. Then Jim Shooter followed up having Marvel do royalties. And then from that point, they did Epic Comic, but there's also a lot of the editorials things because there's other editors like Mike Hobson, who also worked with Shooter on a lot of those policies. So I know it becomes a just Shooter during this period, but he had a lot of editors himself, Mike Hobson, that kind of all worked together to really make Marvel the place. And then ultimately, they had many tie-ins. He did the what's that thing? Secret Wars, which became one of the biggest things and the biggest sellers of his career, and said that crossovers are here to stay. They'd already done many crossovers, but this was a company-wide crossover. Most of the titles outside of maybe Daredevil and Alpha Flight, but most of the company was connected to Secret Wars, and basically would say how the industry was going. And at some point, he started to become a much tougher editor that caused him to ultimately have to leave Marvel. He went on to do Valiant Comics, which was probably, for his own brainchild, one of some of the best stuff he had done with Bob Layton and some other creators, Barry Windsor Smith also. But there were many other names. He had many other comic companies after that, but ultimately a writer, a blogger, and and a storyteller. Definitely a storyteller, an anecdote teller, and I think that covers most of his history. And we'll get to other details, but there we go. Cal, I'm gonna pass it off to you.
Unless you want to say something, Mars.
No, I was just going to just pass it on to you, but I mean, it's amazing. 13 years old. Oh my goodness. I mean, what the heck were you doing at 13, Petey?
I was reading comic books.
And what about you, Kyle? What were you doing?
I was writing comic books.
Oh, so you were not that far apart from him then.
No, it was me. It was me, Eddie, Kagi, and Dennis, and we had all formed our own comic book. We were going to be called Decked. It was going to be Dennis, Eddie, Kagi, and me making comics. That was the name of the comic company. So I had gotten started with story writing a long time before then, and we didn't get it up off the ground because we ran out of paper. Not realizing we could just buy more paper. So
that name really cracks me up. That
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
Hey, still gonna make it happen. Still gonna make it happen. Yeah,
but yeah,
Shooter starting at like 13, 14 years of age, if I remember correctly. He had to be in the hospital for a bit of time, which I always found it interesting. He says he stopped reading comics at about 8 years of age, and he was reading like DC. And then when he got back into reading comics, he was reading Marvel. And that's pretty much the cycle of what they could look to in the comic book industry. DC pretty much had the kids from anywhere from about 6 to 12, and then Marvel would take them from about, let's say, about 12 to 17, 18, even with some people lingering all the way through maybe their early years of university. So I find it very apropos that Jim Shooter is the one going to DC and saying, "Hey, if you write the characters this way, then you'll be able to catch up to Marvel, because this is exactly who Marvel Comics was not necessarily geared towards, but this is the dynamic of the people they were attracting. They tended to be in this age group, and the stories tended to be more character driven. And so with him on the stories with the Legion of Superheroes, we got new characters. We also got things like the death of Feral Lad, which definitely shows somebody who understood what was going on with Marvel Comics, and who better to understand it than their demographic that they're looking to attract. And so, he did writing, and he was accepted to New York. He was accepted to New York University probably at about 17, 18, but also had a position at Marvel waiting for him. And so he couldn't keep up both, took the position at Marvel, and then he eventually had to resign that position because of his financial situation. He would then go through a series of, call them odd jobs, if you will, before coming back to comics. But to start at that early age and to have a very good understanding of what the audience was, what they liked, and how to gear that towards them was something that Jim Shooter maintained. Yeah, I would say he maintained that throughout his entire comics career. We would then go and see. I mean, he wrote on the second Spider-Man Superman crossover, if that wasn't said already. And he had runs on titles here and there, but he also came to Marvel just at the time when Roy Thomas had stepped down, and they had just really they had like a rotating. It was just like a rotating editor in chief. It was one. It was like all these names that you would remember: Len Wein, Archie Goodwin, and nobody was able to stay there because Marvel was expanding so quickly. More titles, more this, more that, and so when Shooter gets there, he's able to give some much needed stability to Marvel Comics, which was notoriously late. What was that phrase they had? The dreaded Doomsday deadline, or something like that. Oh no, the dreaded deadline of doom, something like that. But the books were late, and so he was able to get the books to the point where they were coming out on time. But then you get to like this Mussolini effect because he's being called the dictator. So it's like, hey, he's a dictator, but the trains are running on time. So that was something because Shooter was very much into strict deadlines for writers, for artists. But because of that strict deadline, the books were actually coming out on time. But this didn't endear him with a number of artists. The stories of him uh, being conflictual with certain artists are legendary. Okay, but his his management of Marvel Comics is undeniable. He was editor in chief for 9 years, and through those 9 years, Marvel was very, very successful. I think the work that he's probably most aligned with is Secret Wars, and this is a series that I never thought Secret Wars was that great. But I also remember that I had been reading Marvel Comics before Secret Wars. So I had some understanding of these characters. For a lot of people in the Copper Age, Secret Wars was the series that brought them into comics. So this is how these characters were supposed to be because that was the comic book that brought them in. So this is how Spider-Man is supposed to act. This is how Thor is supposed to act. This is how the X-Men are supposed to act. So when you see Spider-Man, whipping on the X-Men, as a kid, you're like, oh, that's what this character is supposed to be. Whereas somebody who's read the characters already might be like, huh? Why didn't Professor X just? But it brought in a whole new, I don't want to say generation, but it definitely brought in a whole new tier of readership. But for Secret Wars, the not so much the toys, but definitely the people who were coming in and picking up the Secret Wars comics for whatever reason in conjunction with the toy, or because it was a limited series, because the numbering was low on the books, and so kid may not have been as intimidated to pick up a copy of Secret Wars number 5 as opposed to Amazing Spider-Man 238. But that brought in a whole new group of readership, and it was also under his stewardship where we got a lot of the change that Marvel experienced at this time in terms of uh, for lack of a better word, we call the legacy characters happened with Shooter, where we got Rhodey taking over for Iron Man, Beta Ray Bill coming in, or really taking the place of Thor, and then hanging around as a supporting character in later issues. Uh, seeing the Hulk injured, Fantastic Four getting new outfits. There was a good amount of change that happened under under Shooter's stewardship, and he definitely put his hand to penning as well, and eventually his tenure at Marvel, I mean, 9 years. I'm trying to think. I think Stanley. This I don't know if Stanley still holds the record for the long. Yeah, without a doubt, because Stanley was there even before Marvel was Marvel, so he's got the record on that. But then after him, Roy Thomas, Jim Shooter is definitely up there with the staying power in terms of that particular seat, which is not an easy thing to do at Marvel Comics, especially with the way that they were expanding at the time and continue to expand under Shooter. They also flirted more with the direct market, where this was the new system where comics were going strictly to comic book stores, and or in some case, or at least in the case of Dazzler #1, that was a comic that went strictly to comic book stores. It did not go to comic book stores and newsstands. And so in that, they were experimenting with the direct market in terms of how viable it was. And eventually, as we see today, comic books don't even go to the newsstand. It's almost all direct market. But they saw that they could make the money that they were looking for there and not have to worry about returns. And so that became a more viable path for comic books, even if I think it was short sighted in the long term So, we get those great years at Marvel, well, productive years at the end of the day, if not great, because some people would say that they didn't necessarily have the best relationship with Shooter. And then you get a second coming in terms of Valiant. And I can only speak to what I know of Valiant ostensibly because I wasn't reading any of the comics at that time. But the reports that I got, everybody was very pleased in terms of the Valiant line. People were reading it, they were enjoying it. Jim Shooter, and I knew that Jim Shooter was behind it. And, I had other stuff that I was reading, other stuff that I was doing. So I said, okay, I'll get around to Valiant when I get around to Valiant. But I thought that their prospects were going to be much longer than they turned out to be. And before I knew it, Shooter was out, and sometime later, not too much later, Valiant was also defunct. But you could look at that as definitely something that shows his acumen for understanding comics, even which would be a different time period of the '90s, but still being able to put those eyes get put those ideas together and successfully market them. Some of the more classic comics that have happened, like the first Superman Flash race, that was underneath Shooter at DC Comics. So it wasn't that he didn't also leave some seminal marks there as well. He is also the person who created the Parasite, one of Superman's top 10 in Rogues Gallery villains. So, he accomplished a lot. I think I'm not sure how comic book readers or the comic book public refer to Jim Shooter. I think because they hear stories where it does sound contentious with him and certain creators, that they may have developed an opinion on Shooter that's not necessarily friendly. But I always remind people, you didn't have a relationship with Jim Shooter. You had a relationship with the work that Jim Shooter was behind and the product that was put out at that time. And that's my approach to Jim Shooter, that the time period where I was there reading Marvel Comics, what I heard about his work on Valiant Comics, this was someone who understood comics, definitely liked them. Okay. And, without his input, we wouldn't have had a lot of the great stories, great characters, and great time period that we had in comics where he was there stewarding Marvel Comics along, and then again with Valiant. Of course, Jim Shooter, rest in peace, but I really hope that we take in totality his contributions and it just doesn't become another, well, we're going to make this to this Marxist thing of he was the oppressor and these guys were the oppressed. You weren't there. You didn't have that relationship with him. Just have a look at what the contribution was, because that's your real relationship with Jim Shooter and anything that he did at that particular time.
Thanks, Cal. I mean, it's yeah, he has an amazing legacy. I mean, Chris Claremont's run and John Byrne's run on the Uncanny X-Men. I mean, that ushered in a whole new era. Um, you have the Daredevil stories, Walt Simonson's Norse mythology in terms of, the whole gamut of the different realms of Asgard. There's, of course, one story that we're not going to talk about, Beta Ray Bill, but that he let go through. But hey, other than that, he had a pretty amazing run. Let's not also forget, like you said before, the Secret Wars. But once he did that, could he be contained? I passed that back on to PD.
Well, the hard part of it is with the Secret Wars and coming from being a kid reading comic books and not knowing who the creators were, but understanding that when you read Spider-Man, where it is Stan with Steve Ditko, or Stan and John Romita, or then read Spider-Man in the '70s, it felt like the same character. So, like if I'm reading the X-Men and John Byrne is off of it, I felt, I felt when Byrne was off of Captain America, that's where I was looking for him again. But for the X Men, those are like my favorites. So it was kind of like, and the artist, even though I didn't know Dave Cockrum, it was, actually the artist book right before him was a one issue, Brent Anderson, but it was still X Men. It was Cyclops. So it wasn't much till later where I was kind of like, oh, I wish he stayed. But as a kid, it was like, oh, but the problem I was having was the X Men weren't acting the same as they were when Byrne was doing it. So it was kind of like what's happening to my characters? They're kind of changing into something I don't know. And I didn't understand characterization at that point as a kid either. So even when so to go bring it all the way to Secret Wars, it really, even if I think Shim Shooter is very much a fan of how Stan worked the comic books. He's done many stories where heroes fought heroes, especially in his Avengers, wind up where the heroes had to fight the heroes, and that was the trademark of what Stan would do. So when you get to Secret Wars, I understood that dynamic that the heroes are going to fight, but then it was just like it felt like at the time he had all these successes and Thor, Fantastic Four, and X-Men, and I think the Hulk was doing well, the Professor Hulk. But then it's like you get it all in one book. You could read a Bill Mantlo run with the X-Men. It didn't feel like they were different X-Men. It felt like the same characters. When you got to Secret Wars, it was kind of like it was Shooter's versions of. So I'm like, I don't know, 12 or 13, and I'm like, well, why is Cyclops saying, hey, we don't approve of Magneto's methods? And it's like, we don't approve of Magneto trying to kill us. Like he wouldn't say to the Avengers who he's tried to kill that. So it was like some of the voices were off, but at the same time, if you read the thing for the time, he kind of felt that he was the steward of Marvel, and these are the voices. But it's kind of hard being editor in chief. You have these top talents on the book, and the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, Thor, the Hulk. They don't necessarily read the same way they read under the pens of Bill Mantlo on the Hulk. Less so Byrne on the Fantastic Four because most people are used to Reed just being a science guy and the Torch being kind of a jerk. So it's kind of, and the thing is easy to write because you're not really getting into the psychology behind him. So it's like those didn't necessarily felt off aside of the fact that Reed really isn't someone who would take a back seat even if his wife is pregnant, because we have the whole period where he's running around. But I really didn't have that. The X-Men was a little more tougher to read, but at the same time, they say behind the scenes he did kind of feel like with the success of it that in his memos that could be jokes. I think Roy Thomas defended the memo saying between the office that could just be a joke. So it's like I'm not putting too much weight to it, but ultimately, as an editor, he would kind of point out things he was doing in Secret Wars to other people. So, and you also have to remember that the people before, the writer editors, they all went running, because they were struggling with Shooter more than that. Like all the people that were there, like Simonson, Byrne, Miller, at one point they were all very close friends. So to become tumultuous later is a tougher thing to see because you have a Byrne who basically was the only one who really defended him in public to, the Byrne where we hear the stories where, of what happened later after that. So it was kind of like, but all through while they were working together, he was doing as much as he could to defend him, even though he was struggling at the side of some of the stuff with the X-Men. Fantastic Four is different because Shooter kind of, put him on as writer, but at the same time, who's that? John Romita was saying, Shooter was trying to get John Romita to have Byrne, change his whole approach, even though it was working. He was like, "Can you go say something?" And he's like, "No, I'm not saying anything new." I'm like, and then it only comes to later when the Phoenix comes back, where they kind of, well, actually Superman, more so Superman when Byrne did Superman. That's when it all became a big a hotbed between the two of them because Byrne was going to do FF and Superman at the same time. So most of the part of the stories of Shooter ultimately is that he saw the characters closer to where Stan was, and then you had these creators that really keyed into what Stan was doing earlier. Like Walter Simonson would look at Thor and he would have Thor as a man of the people. He had a Thor as a person who would do speeches. And Shooter's Thor was someone who at one point said, "Hey, I can't deal with mortals." He says that in the in the Secret Wars, and he kind of goes into the background after that. So he did kind of see all of what Stan was doing, but at the same time, it was like when you look at the books, it was kind of like he wasn't like the other writers. The other writers were trying to, when they used the other people's character, try to keep the voice, and Shooter kind of saw himself as the steward, and that he had the more right voice. So as a person not knowing the inside part of it, it just kind of read different to me than the comic books. And then even Spider-Man fighting X-Men, they were friends. Like he could recognize Cyclops on the street, like in his plain clothes. So it was kind of like, wouldn't it be a talk before this? But he kind of like, no, this is Stan. This is what Stan would have them get into a fight. And, I think Shooter said at the time, oh, this is Spider-Man. She should have a moment like this. But he also did it for the Wasp. But the Wasp takes out Xavier, Magneto, and the X-Men. So, but he's trying to say that Wasp is formidable also. So, but that's the thing. The interesting about Marvel is that with the late books, and you have to give him a ton of credit for that. Marvel had built into their work that, hey, like people like Neil Adams and Steranko, if I bring this book late, you can't edit it. And then like everybody took that sort of thing. And even though there was tons of things that worked out, even though for Roy Thomas, like he brought back the X-Men, they weren't a success at that time, but he's the one who stewarded bringing them back. And there's Conan, and then Conan was up until the late 80s was a big seller. So as editor-in-chief, Roy Thomas had something he brought in. I think while he wasn't editor-in-chief, he brought in What If. So there's a lot of classic things that Roy Thomas did. And then when you get to Shooter, he kind of took away that portion of writers and artists both being late as hell because they wanted to be more like Stan, being in control of their stuff. And he was, actively editing books. So, it's like, that's really an interesting part. You have to look at Marvel, looking at how they could kind of get through books. And then just the books just came later and later and later. And then people feeling like comic books are dead. So, but not just Shooter. You have people like Byrne, Perez, Frank Miller, where they were like, you guys think it's going to die? All right, see ya. We're having fun here. We're having fun here. But I would also, we hadn't cited his his first Avengers run, which is with many class, but some of the key issues are done by George Perez, and that's some very classic stuff, Bride of Ultron, Korvac, and that sort of thing. So he was, definitely, and the super Count Nefarious storyline. But that's the other thing. I think a friend of mine was pointing out. Not that this is not leading into his thing with the artists, but if you met him at a con early on, now he doesn't do that anymore. If you met him in the 80s and he was like, your favorite is Frank Miller, he'd open up the book to the kids and he'd point out the flaws in it. Here's this, here's that, here's the other. So it was kind of tough, where I think he described Walt Simonson as a big gun that you can't aim. And he had a lot of, I guess you could say, Byrne, Miller, those guys, where you say, what do? You have these talents that are coming to him. And I think one of the better stories of that is Miller coming into him and saying, I want to kill Elektra. And he's like, and this is Frank Miller telling the story. He's like, I want to kill Elektra. And he's like, oh God. And he's like, Frank, tell me a story. And he tells him how he wants to kill Elektra. And he's like, all right, do it. That sort of thing. So it's not just that. You have, Byrne coming in and saying he's going to take out Guardian. You have Walter Simonson saying, I think having Odin in the book, he could fix things a little too quickly. So I'd rather Odin not be in the book, and Odin is gone for a while. So he has, the thing is, he had a lot of talent, doing a lot of pushing the boundaries. They were like hitting their stride. The books are selling. And then now they're like, I want to go to the next level. And then at the same time, I think Chris Claremont took a hit at the Fantastic Four, and Byrne was like, will you fix this? And then he's like, no, just write a story about it. And that's where we got the story where the Galactus eats the Skrull homeworld. It's probably in the trial of Galactus. So we got one of our, one of Byrne's biggest stories to just trying to deal with a swipe that Chris Claremont took at the Fantastic Four. So being able to usher that period on there. The hardest part is Valiant, because Valiant is something that he was definitely the brainchild of. They were dynamic. Some, cover-wise, they were dynamic stuff. Sometimes on the insides, they weren't as dynamic, but the books were selling. He did have a plan for how to keep it going. Some of the books were already getting higher prices in the comic stores because they weren't, they didn't have a big print run like the Image books, like the Marvel books. So they were becoming resale. But then the Valiant people were like, we gotta We gotta print millions of them. There's a market out here. We're missing out on it. He's like, no, we go there, we're gonna kill. We're gonna kill this. We can't keep where it is. And they pushed him out. And some people that he was close with, or like Bill Mantlo. I forget the name of the person, the big money behind it, but they pushed him out, and Bob Layton was running it by himself. And then the books was going through the bus period, and it didn't survive them joining the boom didn't help out. So, they did give hands to Fabian Nicieza, had Dan Jurgens, but it wasn't as successful as the initial run of those books. So, you have a talent. He definitely had a split between people he was very close with as far as artists and writers of the 80s, because everything was moving. And it's hard to say because it's all been going on long. It's hard to say because during the 80s, people started realizing, it's kind of hard to look at it where you had talents. The fans were kind of moving towards talents, but it was a slow move. So when Byrne left the X-Men, the book was selling more. When Perez left the Legion of the Justice League, the book was selling more. And you had, in the 70s that happened too with Kirby. So you can see the editorship, not so much with Shooter, but he was okay when people left. He was okay when ultimately him and Byrne were getting at odds because of Superman. He was okay with it leaving, but at the same time, when sales were going left on those titles, he was no one in comics recognized that these guys are important now. So when Shooter was gone and Tom DeFalco was there, Tom DeFalco would say to anybody they want to leave, like anybody can do these books. Like this books are going to sell whoever we put on it. So hope you guys want to come back, like that sort of thing. Where Shooter wasn't like that, but you could see that sentiment coming along because they'd be like, okay, Burns out the Hulk, let me put Al Milgrom on it. And no disrespect to Al Milgrom, but it was like it's a really big shift, that sort of thing. With the Fantastic Four, at least they got they brought Englehart back, and you have John Buscema on it, so you have people that are coming with some name that could really, keep the sales up, even though the new Fantastic Four wasn't it. The idea of bringing Steve Englehart back could be good. So, there is a split on the struggle. In my opinion, I kind of wish he wasn't as critical to the artists as he's been, because what I said in the con, when he was doing the Legion of Superheroes the last time, I was like, maybe he can have this relationship with Francis Manapul. And when he left the Legion, he's like, Francis Manapul is going to be a great artist when he learns all of this. And he critiqued every bit of it. And I was like, he's never going to work with Francis Manapul again. But definite talent, inspirational to see that he started doing comic books at 13, and to take a giant that Marvel was already a giant when Stan was on it with Jack Kirby, and it lost its footing, and seemingly, not the whole thing isn't all him, but basically being the captain of the ship, helping it steer its way. And then when there's an opportunity where people could go to DC, Frank Miller being one, then we got the royalty system, which was everyone worked out. So, but yeah, I always wanted, the hard part is relationships. So in relationships, to get to your next job, you need to have a big gun where you could just turn and say, hey, what do you want to draw? and that's how I think all of those Marvel guys work. They would just turn to each other and be like, they would kind of, want to keep their artist or their writer happy, that sort of thing. So, yeah.
So, Cal, what do you think of this quote from the New York Times? Jim Shooter, editor who saved the comics industry, dies. He brought order and profit to Marvels in the 80s and helped establish the genre as a popular culture tentpole for decades to come. Wow. Is that not big praise, Cal? What's your take on that?
That's a newspaper headline. I think if you take out some of it, it's true, and the other part is, newspapers unfortunately tend to do a lot of sensationalism these days. It doesn't take away from the contributions Shooter made, but it is a reflection of how little they pay attention to the comics industry when they say a line like "Shooter saved the comics industry." That's not true. He got the books back on time for Marvel, was definitely what they needed for the time period, for the nine years he was there. And the rest of the stuff, you really have to. Well, again, it helps if you know the history. Then you can just kind of just make the correct synapses for yourself, rather than go with their what they're saying. And again, this is a headline for someone who's just passed away, so we might forgive them for embellishing more than they should.
Mhm.
And I mean, they're saying one of the things that they're saying is that his Secret Wars made like all the difference to a degree. I mean, what do you think about
Well,
that?
that goes back to what I said before. If you're somebody who started reading, it tends to be that most people think comics and the characters are perfect, and it just seems to be about the same time that they started reading. So somebody starts reading Spider-Man in 63, and they stop reading like when the art changes or what have you. Oh, it was Ditko and Stanley. That was perfect. Everything else that came afterwards, terrible. Oh, I started reading comics with Secret Wars. That's how these characters are supposed to be. Everything else, terrible. These guys tend to marry themselves to the point in which they came in. And you miss out on a whole bunch of stuff that comes after. And you miss out on a whole bunch of stuff that has come before. So when they say things like that with Secret Wars, yes, Secret Wars was very successful. Yes, it was influential. However, there was a Marvel comic books well before there was ever Secret Wars. There was 20 years of Marvel comics before there was ever a Secret Wars. So this added to what Marvel Comics was, but this was not the be all end all when it came to Marvel Comics in terms of Secret Wars.
And
Oh,
what about what they say? What about when they say that he, his developing the talent and the stories, not the stories, but gave those talent to create some of the most classic characters and stories, like from the X-Men, from Daredevil and Thor. I mean, what do you think it is in terms of his contribution to that, to those particular?
You mean what? Letting them have the freedom to write the stories? That is that
Yeah,
what they're saying?
well, it became some of the most iconic stories and characters based because it happened during his era.
I think that says more about the creators on the books than necessarily Shooter. Shooter just happened to be the guy who was stewarding Marvel Comics when these particular things came out. This That's not to say if Roy Thomas had stayed on that we wouldn't have gotten similar or the exact same stories. And some of these stories may have been ideas that were already chugging along in the pipeline before they got a chance to come out. So you want to give him all of the credit that he's due without doing this, which is amalgamating or aggrandizing what his contribution actually was, because then you get all these people a couple years later, oh, Shooter didn't do anything. He wasn't responsible for this, taking too much credit that, as the internet would like to do. He did a lot. Okay. He did a lot. And mind you, you had other people who are without a doubt talents who didn't last as editor in chief because it's a very big job. It's a very big role. And, they weren't there for as long as Shooter. And the contributions that they made, okay, in terms of being creators, great. Archie Goodwin, Len Went, without a doubt. You have to respect their contributions, but these were not guys who sat in the chair for that long. And so, yes, you can definitely give him some credit for those type of things that came along while he was in the chair. And the biggest thing is that the books were coming out on time, so you could actually get these things out. Kind of hard to do Secret Wars if you're going to someone and they're like, are these books going to come out when the toys are out? Or are they going to come out like it's going to be finished 3 years later or something? Okay, are we going to actually have Secret Wars #3, or are we going to have an origin issue, which is going to be like a reprint of something that happened back in the 60s? So knowing that the books are going to come out, yeah, that helps people to have confidence in the product that you're producing, and your readership is actually able to follow with you consistently. But you got to leave it at that.
well, I'll add into this that, and in agreement, but I will add into it that, for, I think, I don't know for Perez, but more so for, well, I guess he was like that with everyone. More so with Byrne and Miller, like what he didn't teach them anything about the stories they were writing, because he would, reject or, want to add in or throw in a character type of thing as editor in chief. But one thing I think Byrne brings up is that he taught him, about being clarity, that the storytelling needs to be clear, like trying to say it so you show him something. And I think during Byrne's period, Byrne was very, influenced by Neil Adams. So the panels are kind of everything, try to do interesting panel layout. And Byrne kind of pulled away from that for a while, and then as he became even a stronger storyteller, you see him go back to it. But it's like first understanding clarity, and then getting your stories going. I think with Frank Miller said, early on, he kind of helped him with teaching him about storytelling because he could distill. He would take the Human Torch with I think the first time Captain America comes back to Marvel, and he would use that story to teach artists clarity and saying how Jack Kirby kind of laid it out, and he would kind of put those things in their minds, But at the heart other side, they also talk about between the two of them, since they were the young guys, but at the same time they were becoming really successful. A shooter wouldn't say when they got it right, so he would bring up something else they had issue with. But they definitely talk about initially as far as teaching them clarity. That doesn't necessarily work into like like the death of Phoenix or what's the name. He was involved to some extent, but not as big as they say he was. He definitely felt issue with the death of Phoenix, and then Byrne and Claremont. Basically they were struggling with the Byrne and Claremont were struggling that a lot of their stories that they were planning the whole year. Actually, you can go from 100, was it 129 to 150, like a good 21 issues, almost 2 years, where things got restructured. So it's like throw in Dazzler. Don't do this new younger team. Don't do those yet. So they had a younger team planned, and that got gutted until late '80s, and then ultimately the Phoenix stuff happened. So they were at points, they would joke about putting sticking pins in their shooter doll at that period, but they were also all friends, and they also talk about some part post that point where Byrne wasn't on the X-Men, and Byrne's in the office, and you got Claremont and you know you got Claremont, Miller, Stern is in there, Paul Smith probably was in there, and they said, and Shooter looked around and said, there hasn't been this much talent in the room since Stan, Jack, and Steve Ditko was here. So at some point when it was rolling, you could also hear about the friendship between John Romita Jr. and Bill Sienkiewicz. So you had a lot of Moon Knight was rolling. So there was so many titles that were going, and he also was a money. He was also thinking money at the same time. So not just Secret Wars, but looking around and saying, do the X-Men Titans, and also him trying to figure out how to put Byrne and Claremont together. See, with the success of the X-Men, how can we get that success again with with these two again? So, it's an interesting thing because I know I can't. Storytelling wise, he was definitely around during those times when everything was happening. But as Cal was saying, like they were also as far as people looking at them as talent, most of the people might look at their stuff, their Marvel here is better than anything that came after. Like some of their best stuff, and that's Simonson on Thor too. So they were hitting the mark. But also the other side of it is I think Denny O'Neil, who very struggled a lot with Shooter, he was editing Byrne at times on Alpha and Miller on Daredevil, and Denny O'Neil was the one who made the decision, Frank Miller, to write Daredevil, but then he wouldn't really have stuff to edit. He was like, you read the stories. You could read in his from the Den. He enjoyed them, and Shooter was like, he's letting them get away with murder, and he's like, guys, don't tell Shooter that you don't edit my stuff. I don't edit your stuff that much. Tell him that he's tough. I'm tough on them because he's killing me over here. So, it's
That's something interesting because the Hollywood Reporter was also saying something where one of the things he was on Burn, not Burn, he was on Miller so much that he left not once but twice to DC. And one of the things during that time period, he created one of his epic. Uh, um, am I going to say it? Do I have to say it? Dark Knight Returns. Which had a profound
well,
impact on the whole. But could he have done that at Marvel if he had stayed, or he had not been pushed by Shooter, who had a
he
habit of micromanaging? And
he
of course,
didn't.
let's not forget Byrne. Byrne,
Well,
also left,
that
and he went on to go do Superman. According to Hollywood Reporter, that his relaunch was such a big media event. that they put it on the cover of Time
No,
magazine.
that's mixing up the story. The thing came later. But that was because Superman, him being on time was because Superman's 50th. They're mixing it up. Byrne did
Okay.
leave. There was a difference between Shooter and Byrne when Byrne left, but but Byrne planned to stay on both. He was running into a lot of editorial interference when that happened. But Miller is different. Miller he was already doing at some point when he was done with Daredevil, he loosely planned the Wolverine thing with Chris Claremont, but that was in the it was monetarily thought, but they were just joking about doing it in the car ride. They were doing it. Frank Miller at the same time came to Shooter with Ronin. He came to Shooter with Ronin, and he was in talks. The same time Dreadstar, the same time the Star Slammers was happening. The death of it was Jim Starlin who did Dreadstar, and he also did the death of Captain Marvel. So they were in talks to do Ronin with Marvel, but the problem is that I don't know. It might have been epic, but there's also Marvel didn't have the what's that thing? They didn't have the incentives yet. So at the same time, DC, who he's talking to at the same time, and Frank Miller wanted to be, freelancer. He was a freelancer. Jeanette Kahn is saying you can get your rate, what you want, and total freedom. I think Shooter joked about it's like, oh, Ronin would have been a different book if I was here. I wouldn't have let him. It's like, no, if you wanted Ronin, whether sight unseen, you couldn't edit the book. That was the whole point. He wanted to be able to, spread his wings, whether it was successful or not. Initially, the sales were pretty big, but the want of the job was to just, a creative give him total freedom. But he hadn't left. He hadn't left totally. He came back. Actually, they kicked out Denny O'Neil from Daredevil, who was having a little gaining his feet with Dave Mazzucchelli. But when Miller was coming back, Marvel pushed out Denny so he could do Born Again. So Miller just saw himself as a freelancer. I'm pretty sure Shooter might have looked at he took a chance on Miller on Daredevil, which he did, even though Daredevil wasn't a big seller. But Frank Miller really kind of became a big deal, and he was also putting his even I think before the Dark Knight he was also doing. I don't know when he was doing covers for Lone Wolf and Cub, but he was always thinking independent. So he did say he wasn't taking any more jobs when Byrne left, but he ultimately finished his Elektra Lives Again, and Elektra Assassin was going on, so he still had some coals on the fire at Marvel when he was doing the Dark Knight. So I think it's more sensational to say that. Even the Byrne one, it wasn't public at that point. You don't hear Byrne if the Shooter never left Marvel, there's a good chance we would have never heard all of the stories. It wasn't until Shooter was gone where Byrne actually said what happened. He did, I think in interviews, there's one interview where Byrne said about when Jean Grey returns, he's like saying, Shooter asked me to redo it, and I didn't have any time in my schedule. But I said if he could give me a reason why he wants to me to redo it, then I'll try to find time. So I think behind the scenes, Shooter told everyone that he was going to fire Byrne, which he didn't do, and then ultimately Byrne had left. So that one was close, but you didn't really get to see the big thing. The big thing was Byrne being with Marvel so long, talking, the biggest Shooter's biggest defender, saying that he was going to be, he felt like he was a small cog at Marvel. He left. That was a thing that you thought you'd never see. So when he left, I didn't know it was Shooter at that time. It wasn't until some point when Byrne came back where he actually addressed it. So, but it's more sensational as Cal was saying. It's more sensational to say those things.
I got a couple of controversial quotes. Cal, do you have a minute to say it, or do you want to say something else before I jump into it? Cal?
Yeah, sorry, I was muted for a second. There's more controversy than when I got a chance to speak with Shooter at that con, and he gave me that that quotable regarding John Byrne? Yeah, is it
Tell
quote?
us, tell the audience.
Oh God, please no.
Yes, I was getting his signature, and so I asked him, "What do you think of John Byrne on Superman?" He was like, "Oh no, I would have never put John Byrne on that book." He was like, "John Byrne? No." He was like, "Now Walt Simonson,"
Oh my
and he's like, "This is like music to my ears because I'm
God.
always been critical of John Byrne on Superman, and I have wondered, based on what I saw of Walt Simonson and the bit of stuff that he did with Superman. Oh, and you always have that type of thing. If you don't like something, or if you did like something, there's always the what if and the grass always being greener, that type of stuff. But I just found that hilarious. I found that hilarious. He was just like, "What?" John was like, I would have never put him on that book. That was hilarious. But that was just between myself and Shooter. It wasn't recorded or anything, so there's no audio or anything of that nature. I was just there as an attendee getting signatures.
That's so funny. Well, listen, there's a quote from I don't think it's I'm seeing it in Wikipedia, and it says it's from the John Byrne Forum. So this is what John Byrne said about him. This is before, not now. So all these things happened previously, so don't jump on it. So according to John Byrne, Shooter came along just when Marvel needed him, but he stayed too long. Having just fixed about everything that was wrong, he could not stop fixing. Around the time I left to do Superman, I said that I thought Shooter and Dick Giordano should trade jobs. It was DC that needed fixing then, and do so about every 5 years or so. Shooter had put Marvel into a place where all that was needed was a kindly father figure at the helm, and that was not Shooter. Secret Wars was when the trouble really kicked into high gear. We must never forget that Secret Wars began as a toy promotion. He emphasized, we must never forget that Secret Wars began as a toy promotion. Shooter turned it into a way to reshape the Marvel universe in his image. What do you think about that? What do you think about
Hmm.
that?
Sounds absolutely true. I mean,
Well, I,
that's pretty much what we've said on both sides regarding regarding Secret Wars, regarding Shooter. I don't know about the stay too long and that sort of thing because all the way through the time he was there, Marvel was still. It was not like he came on, fixed stuff, and then it broke, and then he had to be ushered out. I do think his management style I think especially for people like Byrne, I think his management style was just not something that they needed. And once the books were out, these guys were probably like, "Yeah, we got it. The books are coming out, and we get it," so on and so forth. And Shooter was never going to lay up off of that. Now, I do like the idea of Shooter going over to DC and seeing if he could have done that at DC Comics. I don't think that would have ever flown at DC Comics, but again, that would have been a yeah, I don't think that would have ever flown. I don't think Shooter would have even tried it because he worked at DC. So, but yeah, I think John Byrne is pretty spot on with that comment.
God
I would
damn.
say I would say with that, no, I agreed with it when I heard it, but the agreement also comes with bringing up the late John Romita, because John Romita was art director. He was in the office with Shooter, and he basically said basically the same thing that the books were the books were running pretty well, but he doesn't necessarily. He said around the time the Secret Wars happened, but he doesn't say Secret was the cause. He just said that Shooter turned to him and said now we got to, basically, we got to fix the books on how, like kind of how he saw, and then everything kind of went. Like, I guess that's around '83, around Secret Wars. So he kind of confirmed what Byrne was saying, but from an internal level, and so it's a tough thing because he also, I mean, I know that Byrne is always used as his biggest enemy, but that definitely one was, as far as talking about him in the public, he was one of the only people to defend him in the Comics Journal. Like in the Comics Journal, Gary Groff is just trying to go at Shooter. It's like, so you think Shooter's, is actually a good writer? He's like, like what's wrong? He's like, well, he tells artists and writers to use the what's it, the Little Miss Muffet sat on a tuffet, that story as a basic on how to write how to write stories. He said, no, it's not. And Bernard, like, no, it's not. It's not to say this how it always done. It's just basically saying the beginning, middle, and end. And it's like, but it's like going, it's but at the same time, the Shooter had some of the toughest quotes during that period too. He was like saying, yes, who was it? I think in the trial of Michael Fleisch, no, Gary Groff and Howland Ellison. He said, yeah, you're here representing Marvel comic books. And he said, well, if you really understood comic books, it's not, you think the names on it as far as writer and artist are the ones, but it's really kind of the editors that kind of, mainly the content you see that comes on the book is really, stuff that they're doing. And then he also said, yeah, personally, he said, well, someone like Chris Claremont, he said, yes, Chris Claremont is the writer of the X-Men. The author is Marvel Comics. And they say when he said that, that kind of just shook the, so he was, he wasn't someone that wasn't, afraid of saying something or saying something publicly or controversial, but at the same time, it definitely having the stuff that was going on. The thing is, it just goes a little extra, like with the toy. I think with the toy promotion part, the thing is that with the success of Secret Wars, he was kind of trying to say that I couldn't let any of the other writers go on there because they would use the thing to destroy someone else's character, and that would be the difference between Byrne just saying, "Hey, it was a toy promotion," and no one was jumping to it, and then but he was saying, "Oh, I don't want the guys to fight," so I decided to do it. But they didn't want to actually do a crossover, and that's something I think a lot of people talk about. Well, this is how Spider-Man, thinking that everyone was sitting in the office and Shooter was like, "Hey, you give Spider-Man a new costume. You put the She-Hulk on here," and it was the lasting effects to the comics where they were like, "Come up with something, come up with something for a change." So the Hulk leg was broke at the end. You see Spider-Man's new costume actually came from, I think who's it? Iron Fist was going to get an alien costume because his costume was always ripped, and since he was partial alien, they were going to give him an alien costume. I think Claremont and Byrne, but they didn't use it. So then at some point, I think Roger Stern was going to use it, and then I think Spider-Man guys didn't have any ideas what to do to Spider-Man, and they were like, "Hey, Stern, you still got that? Can I use that alien costume?" He's like, "Yeah, we only want to use it for one issue." Like, and then Shooter hearing like, "Oh, you guys gonna this? You can't give him a new costume. This is just wrong." And then when he said, "You guys got to get rid of it as soon as you can," he said, "Oh yeah, don't worry." And then when they saw the sales for the first issue, that Spider-Man, they were like, "Can you keep him in the costume for a little while longer? Like, don't get rid of it." I think he has his first issue in 258, but then at some point he gets a regular version and switches from costume to costume from time to time. So, so those sort of changes was kind of like just come up with something. So I think the X-Men, they bring a giant dragon back to Japan. So, and they have to fight a dragon in Japan. So that's kind of what they bring with them. I can't think of all the other stuff besides those three things. And I said the She-Hulk.
Right. So I have three quotes
Oh
before we
God,
close out
no
this.
more quotes.
Yeah, three quotes
These are
before,
getting
but
worse.
these are actually from, well, actually it's for one. You have Hammer said that he in the
Hold
Hollywood Reporter that he
on a
was a
second.
very
Hold on. When you say three quotes, you have three more, or you have or you had three in totality, including the ones you've already given.
three more. So three more, and we wrap it up. But I just thought some of them were pretty quick. You don't have to. You can just tell one, two things.
We're
Okay,
gonna
One,
just
Larry Hammer.
Google them.
Larry
just jump
Hammer.
to the quote. Just jump to the quote.
Yeah, Larry Hammer said that he was a complicated man, and the one thing people don't give him credit for was that there was an arthritis who got sick and ended up dying, and he made sure the artist writer's wife got his health insurance. And the reason was that in Marvel they had a policy not to do the health insurance until Wednesday, and unfortunately the artist died on Tuesday. So I guess he was just highlighting that story to show he always tried to do the right thing. It wasn't like he was doing things to be mean.
No, he's right. I mean, Shooter was there when Marvel started their the participant percentages, royalties. That really improved while he was there. The great irony is that I don't even know if they do it anymore.
No.
And this is mostly it's not even because of the higher ups. It's really the talent. Where the talent decided they wanted to do more play, pay and play stuff because they didn't want to give up their own creations. They wanted to save that stuff for their independent line, and so it just didn't. It really didn't. They eventually they stopped doing it. But one of the reasons why you have somebody like a Rob Liefeld who's sitting pretty is because he created a bunch of characters at the time that he was in Marvel. He had new characters coming out every month that he was on X Force or New Mutants, and two of them hit. Cable became very popular, and Deadpool exponentially popular, and he participates in that to this day. So yeah, Shooter was there when that started. And again, they were taking a page from DC, where with guys like Neil Adams and Elliot S. Megan, who were like, no, we need to do these things. We need to get, we need to be able to participate. We definitely need healthcare because they're I mean, in the type of business they were, if you got older and for whatever reason you had back problems from being hunched over for so many years, you couldn't write as well because of your hands, your vision wasn't as good, so it took longer to produce the pages. Well, okay, you're not producing as much work, but you still may need to go to the dentist and the doctor. So the stuff like that from under Shooter, it improved. That's something I don't think can be said too much of. It improved without a doubt.
Well,
Another quote.
I'll just say, Byrne also pointed out that, you know, Shooter was definitely not above, getting the money to the creators because they also would pay for the artists to travel to the cons rather than them figure out how to get there or be in town or that sort of thing, and pay. I think they definitely were paying for the phone bills when Byrne was in Calgary for the X-Men, the other thing is that, the much maligned Alpha Flight 6, where it's like the assistant editor month, where Snowbird fights a monster in the snow in a snowstorm, and it's all like a good 4 or 5 white pages. Even though Byrne laid it out, he said, "Nope, the Shooter said this is a storytelling thing. You definitely get paid for this." So it's like he definitely wasn't stingy with Marvel money. Ultimately the incentives, they had to do it because DC was already doing it, and they also like the hard part is that he knew DC, but DC had a lower benchmark for the Suns anyway, so it wasn't like they had the Marvel benchmark. They were a lot of people were getting royalties, and they were doing DC Comic Presents. So they would get royalties even in books that weren't selling as much as Marvel. Marvel might have had a higher benchmark, but Marvel just kept selling more and more, so it didn't matter. So like something like Alpha Flight, I think when Byrne went to get the check, I think the person giving it to him said, "I think this is wrong. I think there's too many zeros." He's like, "No." So sorry, go back to the rest of the quote. Sorry.
So the next quote he has. This is from the.
I'm sorry. Just one quick addition. You have to also remember Shooter's upbringing. Well, literally, he grew up and his family was struggling financially. And one of the stories he tells is that his father, couldn't get to work because the car was so old and the engine just had broken down. But when he got his first check from DC Comics for writing, he was able to, buy a brand new engine, so his father didn't have to work any longer. So, he obviously didn't forget those type of roots of what it means to struggle financially.
The one is from someone we know, and one is the worst advice. This is from the Jim Shooter page, his own page. These are his 10 quotes, and he says,
Oh God.
"This one, the worst advice Stanley ever gave me: work with the devil himself if he has talent." And he says, "Nah, I learned that devils, no matter how talented, are never worth it. They have a corrosive effect. They ultimately hurt the team, and there are plenty of people out there just as talented who aren't spewing poison." I was wow. And the last one he gave us here is about our artist Paris Cullins. One late night at Valiant, when we were ordering burgers, regarding his lifelong love affair with cheese, he said, "I'd eat a baby's butt if it had that cheese on it."
Why would he say that?
That's what he quoted Paris Cullins as saying.
That's
I don't know.
It
I don't know
definitely
Paris.
sounds like Paris. I will not. I'll still say that. I know.
that sounds like something Paris Collins would say.
I would say that what's it? Is it hyperbole? I know the Shooter it likes to stretch the truth sometimes, but that one sounds. I'm sad to say, why would he say that? Because it really sounds really close to it. And I'll say in meeting Paris, knowing that he censored some of the stuff he was saying about other talents. So it's like sometimes with a grain of salt, we can pull back on some of this stuff. But
But I wonder who he's talking about when it comes to the devil. Like, no, whoever this person was, it wasn't worth it. I'll find somebody else. When he's referring to, that quote right over there, I would like to know who he was referring to in terms of the devil, spewing poison.
mm,
Yeah, I mean, he has some crazy quotes here. I mean, he has one that says, "An exasperated Marvel executive, Vice President Joe Calamari, to me, when my wars with upper management were their hottest, regarding the complete ignorance of the comic business they owned. We can't fire you. You're the only one who could tell us who could
he's,
replace you." That's what he said. I
I
mean, you
can't.
got
That's
to
the
give
thing.
Shooter some cojones for saying that about himself.
He
So,
he says he likes to say his boss Jim Galton didn't know anything about comic books. That's the toughest thing. Or the other quote I think that's kind of mixed up is him saying, well, it's not as I don't think it came into that. He's saying that Byrne went to Jim Galton and Jim Galton said, "Who is John Byrne?" And it's just like it's tough because sharing the wealth. Wish R.I.P. the shooter. It's always good to sharing the wealth. I always would like. I don't think Paris answered the question because Paris did like the Zero issue to Magnus, a robot fighter, and I bought that off the stands, and I was like, oh yeah, I'm definitely buying this book. And I was like, I don't know why Paris felt like a Marvel guy. Is that why isn't he just taking on any Marvel titles? But Paris ultimately didn't do the regular title of what's the name, but it felt like a perfect fit. Bob Layton was doing the inks, and I was like, I'm gonna be here forever, and it didn't happen. But it's good to see that he was hanging out with Paris, which is fun to hear.
so to wrap it up, I mean, I don't know. What is the best headline that we could say about Shooter? Yes, he was complicated, but was he the one that made Marvel successful in an era that it was very successful in, or wouldn't have been made, or would it have been successful without him? I mean, I guess we have to err on the side of caution. Cal?
That's not a question for Jim Shooter. That's a question for Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Don Heck,
Yes.
Steve Ditko. That's a question, and that question has already been answered. Okay, this was not a fledgling or a struggle. This wasn't Valiant Comics. Okay, this was not a fledgling or a struggling comic book company or comic book universe. And Shooter came in and said, "Hey, wait a second, you guys, you're doing it wrong. This is how you do it over here." This was something that already proven that it could work. It had been working, for some period of time. And then when he got there, he was like, no, 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 no. We need to make these particular corrections. And he did, and the company benefit from it. That's it. It should not be this. It shouldn't become this thing of, uh, literally these guys want to make it look like there was some dragon getting ready to eat Marvel Comics, and Shooter came in on a white horse with an enchanted sword and slew it. Like, no, he understood this is what we need to do these things more efficiently. We have to do these things so these books can come out on time. He had a good understanding too of what that readership at the time wanted. Okay, that's without a doubt. He had a very good understanding. He had a good understanding of that from the time he was writing at DC Comics. So he was definitely good with those things. But I don't know how many 13-year-olds take a year to analyze stories of Marvel and DC. I don't know how many, people actually do that. But the other stuff, again, you know, I, I don't like it because people will be very quick to latch onto that, say these particular things. And then when they finally get corrected with actual evidence, they don't say, oh, I was wrong. Let me give the man the credit that he's due. They swing to the other side of the pendulum. And now, like, we got to tear him down. How dare he lie to us? And it was never him. It was headlines from, one of these sensationalist rags. I don't want to say any names, but you know exactly the place that I'm
You
talking
cannot
about.
call the New York Times a rag, bro. You got to take that back.
Well, I will not call the New York Times a rag unless the New York Times is acting like a rag. But so there you go, right there. Look, we know all about the New York Times right now. Look at these articles. Okay, it all went downhill when they had that guy over there who was publishing stuff and he didn't write it. Okay, and they couldn't catch it themselves. All the news that was fit to print my ass.
Oh my
No, my
gosh.
father would say all the news that fits will print. That's his version of it. But he actually worked there. So I will say you also have to say I totally agree with Cal, but the thing is that it's not just Shooter and putting forth him by himself. And that's not to take anything away from it. You also have to imagine that when they said editor, it's like one person at Marvel. There wasn't the editor in chief, and they had assistant editors, or they would have gophers or associate editors. So those guys helped the writer editors like Lean Wen, or Marv Wolfman. These guys had 3 or 4 titles, and then you just had regular writers who would be, was it Gary, was it Friedman or something like that, Friedrich, something like that. Some of these other guys that were there, but they would be under the top editor, who'd be Roy Thomas, Stan, that sort of stuff, and they all had a different style of editing. Stan had to pull back because he wanted to rewrite everything, so he had to learn to pull back. But at the same time, you have to say, as tough as he was, in just instituting an editor program of having people who would, I think Byrne talks about, him vetoing a lot of, you know, um, Chris Claremont's stories, and he's saying, the book went into higher success, so it's kind of holding them back. But those stories that Byrne, and he's like saying, yes, it's a little bit in jest, but there is some truth to it, because you have Louise Simonson there, and she's listening to what Chris's ideas and saying, yeah, let's do it. They're copying what's going on in the present day. The books are selling way, the X-Men is selling way more. And this relationship between, Jim Shooter pulling Louise Simonson to the X-Men, and then later getting someone who wasn't in comics Anna Senti, and her working with them to the Mutant Massacre stuff. So it's like, and these are ideas that Chris had, but it's like, and at the same time, they said when Chris didn't have any ideas, there would be ideas that she had told them, that she kept a note of and said this, that, and the other. You have bringing Denny O'Neil, who's a accomplished writer, but he's working with these talents, and him making the decision, having to figure, how do I deal with this Daredevil thing? The artists don't like each other anymore, and Miller, but it was more Miller wanting to write. So he's like, I think Miller is kind of the guy that's pushing this. Let's try it out, and if I have to, if I have to edit it, I'll just fix it, and I'll fix it in editing. And he didn't wind up having to do it, or even let's see, and people who went on afterwards. Even though Shooter was very tough on Mike Carlin, Mike Carlin went to be a big name at DC, working with Byrne on Superman, and then taking over being the Triangle editor for who knows how long after that. So you had these, and Mark Grunwald, who's the person who turns to Walt Simonson, saying, "Hey, this book is not selling." Like, and Walt Simonson worked on Thor in the '70s, but and to go back to that other part of the '70s and the comics failing, yes, people felt comics would be done in 5 years, but you also have to remember that Marvel was still selling more than DC. So it's like, whether as bad as they were doing, it was still the stumbling giant, because it wasn't as, just Marvel was repeating the story. It felt like the same. Now, some of those same guys repeated stories that Stan and Jack did, but they just had a different flair to it. They were bringing other ideas from other places, but then they also had editors. So, you have Mark Grunwald saying to Simonson, "Hey, here's some ideas, but you basically got carte blanche." And he was like, "Well, I do like the idea of someone else picking up the hammer," and he developed that. But otherwise, the rest is him. But so having an editorship, but with him and a number of editors that ultimately helped, and or they became writers themselves. So it's a team effort, but you also have a captain in the team, and it kind of works out, that sort of thing. So the success of Marvel was up there, and DC found this feeding at times. I mean, they figured out more, I guess, after '86, but they had a couple successes, and they were trying to figure it out along the way. It just, Marvel was really killing, and then when they'd have a success, they weren't above saying, "Oh, Micronauts a success, X-Men Micronauts." "Oh, Thor's a success. Oh, X-Men in Asgard." It's not above something that's going to be a big seller. I would say the biggest misstep, and I think he does defend it. I mean, we could say Secret. We could say what's not Secret Wars. We could say the New Universe. The biggest misstep is Heroes for Hire. No, Heroes for Hope. Heroes for Hope. The charity book for
The Heroes Initiative.
for famine, because they used the X-Men. They should have used a more regular title, because X-Men has so much risque stuff, and Shooter was pointing out that they were complaining about some of the risque stuff, and he was like defending it, and it's like, no, it was a little. You're looking at it like, this isn't the X-Men. X females coming out in lingerie, that sort of thing. Is like, it should have been what the DC books. They had Superman and Batman, and that figured out. The X-Men is the biggest thing, but they're not. They are kind of they're cult. They're still a cult team. They weren't had a cult following anymore. But that's the only thing I can see that he defends that he shouldn't have, because the X-Men are too risque at times, and having that Hellfire outfit type thing in the book, the book was kind of weird. So I read his blog on that one, and I was just like, no, look at it again. I was like 15 or 16, and I still had some misgivings on certain comic books where I would open up and I'd be like, Black Kiss, what is this? But anyway, but yeah, definite talent, and definitely, if he didn't do it himself, he definitely had a team of editors and the publisher, Mike Hobson, to really get Marvel back on track. And the talent was some of the favorite things that fans like are during this period. The X-Men had a little period before Shooter got there. He was only assistant editor, but when Bernie Clammer was kind of coming on, but he was involved a little bit in obviously the death of Phoenix. So all the stuff where these guys got their most memorable work while they're working during his period. And even though you have a period with Tom DeFalco that was way more monetarily successful, you don't have kind of the stories that were there. So it's a period, a glowing period from 78 to 87 of Marvel where he was at.
Okay. Any final words, Cal, before we close this out?
No, Jim Shooter, rest in peace.
Rest in peace.
R.I.P. If you like what you hear, give us a thumbs up, comment, subscribe. Spin a rack.
We are out.